It's already the penultimate lecture in our series, and I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Falco Pfalzgraf from the Queen Mary University in London, because he provides a much needed regional extension to our lecture series. So after having been to the furthest north of the German-speaking areas with the lecture by Nils Langer, and we are now going to Austria, and it also will segue really well into the last lecture we are going to have next week by Geraldine Horan, who is looking at totalitarian nationalistic language and this dangerous border area of national pride in language and Muttersprache, a topic we already saw with Martin Darrell, and the nationalistic element will, I think, become very apparent with this case study we are going to see today. And I can recommend the new publication by Falco Pfalzgraf, where he unterfüttert the whole area with a lot of data. It's quite heavy reading, but worthwhile to, after you've listened to his introduction, to work your way through that. Also, as a kind of advertisement break, there will be another lecture that would fit ideally as a week 9 continuation into our lecture series about gender neutral language in times of coronavirus. Very appropriate. It's also gender just language is also one of the topics we deal with in our historical linguistics series. And you will be able to register for that via the website of the Gesellschaft für Deutsche Sprache in London, where which Falco actually is heading. So that will be Natalia Filatkina from Hamburg. You might have heard her name already in the lecture by Claudine Moulin, because she studied with Claudine and is a historical linguist who, like many of this very worthy group of colleagues, has a lot to say about contemporary discourses of language. With that, over to Falco.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henrike. Let me start and first of all share the presentation. Just a moment. Here we go. Okay. So I hope everybody can see a full screen presentation now.
Yes.
I can't see you anymore. So if something goes wrong in the sense of that the picture disappears or something, just let me know. I will mainly be talking about the Verein Muttersprache Wien today, but I want to start in the good old German tradition by historischer Hintergrund. So I'll look at a bit at how the Verein Muttersprache Vienna came into being, which is quite important to understand why it is, what it is, and who the people are, and why they act the way they do. So I thought I was hoping that that Nils might have covered this a bit too, but he was more general, which is absolutely fine. I enjoyed his lecture very much. But I'll talk a bit about one of the largest, or the very largest institution that of linguistic purism in the history of the German language. It was the time when linguistic purism became institutionalized. And we are talking about the Allgemeiner Deutscher Sprachverein. And what happened in the late 19th century, in 1885, is that Hermann Riegel, he was a museums director. Actually, he was an art historian who what he did is he asked the general German population, if you will. He said, we need this, we need to protect the German language. Can somebody please establish an association for the German language? We need to have one to protect German from disappearing. And what happened is that just a month later, Hermann Dunger, who was a school teacher, a grammar school teacher, a Gymnasiallehrer, he founded the first branch of the Allgemeiner Deutscher Sprachverein, the General Association for the German Language. Dunger sometimes appears as professor, but that's because the Gymnasiallehrer were called Gymnasialprofessor at the time, but he was by no means a university professor in that sense. That was in September 1885, and then just 3 months later, the Vienna branch was founded. So it was one of the earliest branches of the ADSV. The ADSV you should imagine as like one core main branch with many sub-branches, so pretty much like the Gesellschaft für Deutsche Sprache is organized today. And the aims of the Allgemeiner Deutscher Sprachverein were, I'm going to say that in German, even though it's here in English on the PowerPoint. So the aim was, or the aims were, das allgemeine nationale Bewusstsein im deutschen Volke zu kräftigen, die Reinigung der deutschen Sprache von unnötigen fremden Bestandteilen zu fördern und die Erhaltung und Wiederherstellung des echten Geistes und eigentümlichen Wesens der deutschen Sprache zu pflegen. So that was their aim, and they were quite successful, and they had lots of members. At their peak, they had over 50,000 members, and they were a powerful organization. And you might remember from Nils' Vortrag that there was a question, how successful can Purism be? And Nils said, rightly so, that of course it has often to do with school, but also it has to do with having the right people in the right positions. And that was very much the case with the ADSV. Many of the members were powerful in the higher ranks of the society, even close to government. For example, we had the Oberbaurat, senior building officer officer Otto Sarrazin. By the way, an ancestor of today of the controversial Mr. Sarrazin of today, whose first name I can't say out of the top of my head. Thilo, I think. No? Yeah. So an ancestor, and this Oberbaurat, what he did is he translated around 1,300 terms that were used in Germany and that were common usage at the time of French origin. He managed to replace them successfully in the areas of civil engineering and railways. So, for example, people would say Barriere in the past. They had to say Schranke after Sarrazin, or Perron was changed to Bahnsteig, Retourbillett to Fahrkarte. Many of these terms still exist in Switzerland because their influence of this didn't happen. No, Coupé, Abteil, or Velociped, Fahrrad. That's one of his main achievements, so to say. And how could he do that? Well, you just couldn't buy a Retourbillett anymore. They would say, you can't get one here. You have to ask for a Rückfahrkarte. So that was very powerful. There was no customer service at the time in that sense. And then we had the Generalpostdirektor, so something like the General Postmaster, he would be called in the US at least, who also had successfully replaced words that have become common usage today. For example, Kuvert was replaced by Briefumschlag. Postrestant is Postlager, and now rekommandiert, we say per Einschreiben, Rebousement, Nachfrage, and many more. So that was really successful, and it was a purist, a regulatory attempt that was successful. So we must say the ADSV was a successful organization, very influential as well. Just to show you a bit about what kind of organization it is, I mean, their main aim was to strengthen the German national conscience. And I've got some quotations here from their Zeitschrift, from their publication, which, by the way, was called Zeitschrift des Allgemeinen Deutschen Sprachvereins in the beginning, and then later was called Muttersprache, and that's still, of course, unfortunately, the name of the GFDS publication. In my view, it's a bit unfortunate. So I've got some quotations here from their Zeitschrift. I have most of them at home, and by the way, most of these Zeitschriften are available from the Internet Archive, archive.org, where you can find, of course, all sorts of interesting stuff, at least if you look for historical texts. So when World War I broke out, and the First World War broke out, the ADSV wrote in its Zeitschrift, der Krieg hat das deutsche Sprachgewissen geweckt, die Fremdtümelei erscheint jetzt deutlich als das, was sie ist, eine nutzlose, haltlose, würderlose Charakterschwäche der Deutschen. Deutscher spricht Deutsch. We find the same arguments, by the way, of course, in the VDS, which was mentioned by Nils the other week. There was also the idea that the war cleanses the language, der Krieg reinigt die Sprache. So there were high hopes at the beginning of the war. However, when the First World War came to its end and it was clear that Germany had lost it, then they feared the Ausrottung der deutschen Sprache. The ADSV went on with the general political climate in Germany, went along with that, and in the 1920s already in their Zeitschrift from the 1920s, we find adverts for Hakenkreuzwegweiser, so a sort of a calendar. Then they were advertising germanische Namensschildchen mit Hakenkreuzen, so some kind of name badges where you would have your nice swastika here. And they also had signet rings, Siegelringe, Hakenkreuz, Siegelringe. So that was very fashionable. We must, of course, keep in mind that the Nazis took over a lot of these general völkisch symbols from all sorts of other organizations. No, I mean that's something the Nazis did really well to get everything, all the völkisch movement under one umbrella, so to say. In 1923, the Allgemeiner Deutscher Sprachverein renamed itself to Deutscher Sprachverein, so the general disappeared from the name. And in the 1930s, so when Hitler was really getting more and more powerful, especially in 1993, of course, when Hitler came into power, they wrote in the Zeitschrift Deutschland erwache, das heilige Erb- und blutgebundene Sprachgut zu säubern und zu reinigen. That was their task, no? To cleanse and purify the holy blood heritage of the language. So we can already see this blood metaphor here. And quite interestingly, der Deutsche Sprachverein ist die SA unserer Muttersprache. So we can already see where it was going, everything. And of course, the Sprachverein was, in the beginning at least, very happy with the Nazis, because it seemed that the Nazis supported the then Deutscher Sprachverein, DSV. So, for example, the Minister of Interior, der Innenminister Wilhelm Frick, he instructed his administration to avoid foreign words, and he used the publications of the DSV for that. There were Verdeutschungsbücher, so translation books and translation lists that were used. And, one would think, and that's what the ADSV members and leadership believed, that the Nazis would support a kind of a cleansing of the language from non-German elements. So they weren't even shy of criticizing, the very high up Nazis, such as Goebbels. Why would he call himself propaganda minister when Werbung would be the more appropriate word, and so on. And, you can probably imagine that didn't go down very well. Also, it didn't go down very well, the suggestion to replace Konzentrationslager by Vernichtungslager or Straflager. The Nazis knew very well why they used foreign terms and not the very German words. And apart from the idea of maybe hiding something, it has also to do with the idea of appearing modern, right? The Führer always came with a plane or by plane or by car, So they also presented themselves as kind of very, very modern and, at least in the beginning, also a little bit open, one must say. So this increasing criticism, as I said, didn't go down well with the leaders of the Nazi Party, of the country, in fact, then already. And it was in 1937, Goebbels quite openly criticized the Deutsche Sprachverein in his May Day speech. So, but if you look at it in hindsight, it's strange that they didn't see what was coming there. I mean, it was, you could see the mess piling up, so to say. And that culminated, in fact, in the 1940s, when in an edict, the an edict from Hitler. Well, it wasn't Hitler himself who published it. It was published in the, I'm going to show you in a second, in an official paper, government publication. And the wording was, der Führer wünscht nicht derartige gewaltsame Eindeutschungen und billigt nicht die künstliche Ersetzung längst ins Deutsche eingebürgerte Fremdworte. Yes, Fremdworte they wrote, not Fremdwörter. And that was in the Amtsblatt, so in the official publication of the Ministry for Science, Education, and and general education for all the German areas. Just a screenshot here for you. That's also available in archive.org. So I'm moving on to Vienna, and I'm doing so by starting with saying a few words about Karl Tekusch. I came across Karl Tekusch when I started working on Austrian Purism. And Tekusch was one of the members, of the very active members of the Vienna branch of the Sprachverein, of the DSV or ADSV, ADSV, I just call it Sprachverein. He had very radical views and very radical demands how to change the language. And he wanted it to be really, his idea was back to the Germanic roots. Sprachechtheit, he called that. I don't want to go into detail. I've written, there is a monograph about it that I published some years ago. But the interesting thing is that his ideas were so extreme that even the extremer people, the extremer members of the IDSV, especially in the leading ranks, said, "We've got to get rid of this guy. He's overdoing it. We have to, we've got to expose him. Expulsion is necessary." So there were several years of tension, and it's very nicely can be seen very nicely in the Zeitschrift des Sprachvereins. And what Tekusch also did is, because he was unhappy with how lame the ADSV was, not extreme enough, not doing much there in his view. So he founded something called Germanischer Sprachverein Wien, Germanic Language Association Vienna. He founded it in 1933 when Hitler came to power, but pre-forms of this association had existed since the 1920s in kind of work groups, and there was activity since the 1920s. So Tekusch has been working on that for many, many years already. So what happened then? You remember that Tekusch was that some of the leaders of the ADSV said, we must get rid of Tekusch. He's not, he's too extreme for us. Well, what happened then is that the Anschluss came in 1938, and Austria became part of the German Reich. And then, surprise, surprise, all of a sudden, Tekusch became the chair of the Vienna Association, and just right the opposite of expulsion, actually. So he became the head. That happened because he was an alter Kämpfer. Alte Kämpfer, old fighter, are those National Socialists who were active already, for example, in Austria at the time when the National Socialists were still illegal, when the NSDAP were illegal. So they were party members, so to say, secretively. And those were put into leading positions after the Anschluss. So he remained chairman until the activities ceased. And what I want to say is that this edict of Hitler, let's be very clear, Hitler never forbade any of the Sprachvereine. He just said, we don't want these activities. What they did is they suppressed especially that activity of Germanization of non-German words, supposedly non-German words, loan words. Towards the end of the war, there was a lack of paper for printing the Zeitschrift and so on. But, despite what we read in some Sprachgeschichten, it's a fact that that many branches were active until the end of the war and beyond. In Berlin, still in February 1945, under heavy bombings, they were still giving they were still on the phone lines if you had a question about what's the correct term to use. I mean, it's unimaginable, but the phone lines worked quite well until the very end of the World War. We know that Hitler was making phone calls until the very last day. In any case, so let me just point out that there is this myth flowing around that Hitler forbade these associations. And it's important to say, no, that wasn't the case. Silke Wieschaus has written a wonderful book about it, where she proves it very clearly. I'm saying this because many of the associations say, our predecessor was forbidden by the Nazis. They were against us. But nothing was forbidden. Hitler just said, don't, stop translating words such as a Tisch into a more German word. Right. So Tekusch remained chairman of the Austrian branch until the activity ceased, which was around before the mid-40s, obviously. So maybe in 43, 4, something like that. 42 is the position of the association. And after the Second World War, Tekusch was forced into retirement. He was a school teacher because he was a membership of the NSDAP. And he founded in 1949. He was not a founder. He became the chairman of the Verein Muttersprache Wien, about which I am talking here. Now, this association, Mother Tongue Vienna, Verein Muttersprache Wien, has always been and still is the largest and most active language protection organization in Austria. Its most determined members comes from the educational elite. I will soon show you some numbers, who they were, who the speakers were. It was lots of university professors, lots of teachers. There were some working men and women as well, but very few. It was founded in November of 49. And explicitly, Tekusch was made a chairman, so that it was clear that it's a kind of a succession organization of the DSV. And in 54, Erwin Mehl became Obmann. That's another important figure. Tekusch became the deputy and remained the deputy until he died. The Verein Muttersprache started only with about 100 members in the early years, but in the peak they had 1,884 members, which in 75, which is quite a bit. I mean, it's not a huge organization, but it's bigger than the Voluntary Fire Brigade or something. So now I was looking at the heydays of the Verein Muttersprache Wien. I originally wanted to look at everything, and after a year I realized it's just not doable. So I said, okay, I'm going to stick to the heydays, which was the time of 1949 to 1984 under the chairmanship of Tekusch and Mehl. And at that time, the Verein Muttersprache Wien has a publication. It's called Wiener Sprachblätter. And they exchanged it with other organizations, clubs, and the like. Show me yours, I show you mine. And there were 28 organizations they exchanged their publication with. 15 of those were in Austria. 13 were abroad. Of course, most were German-speaking. So, I mean, there were 7 in West Germany, 1 in the GDR, and then a couple in Belgium, France, and Switzerland in the German-speaking areas, Alsace-Lorraine, Belgium, and the Belgium minority area, and so on. They organized, in these 35 years I've looked at, they organized 257 public lectures given by 199 individuals. That's a lot. That's an average of 7 per year, 7 point something per year, 7.4. Especially considering that from 1975 they only did 1 per year. So they had up to 18 some years, sometimes 12, in the hot phase, in the heydays. And they ran lots of campaigns against Anglicisms and pro-good German in newspapers and in all sorts of public events where they engaged. Right. So what were their main activities in these 35 years I looked at? Basically, they were bashing Anglicisms. That was their main task. They called it Engländerei in the good old tradition, Engländerei in der deutschen Sprache. They very much, I don't want to say pestered, actively approached the ministries, the people in high position connected to teaching, Lehrplan, and so on. They wanted to promote the German, the old German Kurrentschrift, the handwriting style Sütterlin, They wanted to keep that. They wanted to return back to that. They also wanted to keep the Fraktur typeface, and they were very much against Antiqua. All their publications, at least at the time I looked at, was all in Fraktur entirely. You'll see later that that changed. Interestingly enough, just as a side remark, it was Hitler, of course, who forbade, and that was really forbidding it, the Frakturschrift. He said he called it the Judenlettern. But of course, I mean, that's a very interesting chapter. I'm not going to go on about it, but actually what was behind it was that Hitler realized you couldn't run the world with Fraktur in the public administration. You know, he saw that in France already, it wouldn't work. To make a long story short, it was Hitler who abolished Fraktur officially. But apart from promoting Sütterlin and Fraktur, and they really wanted to forbid Antiqua. You know, no, it's un-German. Of course, it's kind of has this Latin background. And what they did is they also promoted the use of German in all sorts of areas. For example, forenames. Names like these are the names I've chosen those because they are Tekusch's daughters. And sons, son and daughter. So Ingeborg, Hildgund, Horand, these names, rare but definitely German. So they didn't want, surely they didn't want names like Sarah. That was of course absolutely terrible. So we see already where they're coming from, you know, and even names like Matthias were completely unacceptable to them. They also were obsessed with the names of months as the ADSV, in the tradition of the ADSV. So they used Hartung instead of Januar, Hornung instead of Februar, and so on. Julmonat instead of Weihnachten, instead of December, excuse me, and so on. They also insisted on what they perceived as the correct usage of toponyms. So they wouldn't say Łódź or Lodz, they would say Litzmannstadt. And they wouldn't say Ljubljana, they would say Laibach, so the German toponyms. And of course, you know, as you heard from Nils, all purists have this idea of the good grammatical forms. The genitive is instead of the dative. I mean, that's the main thing that we still have today. No? Der Dativ ist dem Genitiv sein Tod. It just doesn't stop. And we see that how they do it in, I've got a little quotation here just to show you how they write, aus den Gedichten unseres Mitgliedes Regierungsrates Ernst Suchan. So, okay, I mean, yeah, it all comes down to taste, doesn't it? I mean, it's wonderful. That's what also Nils pointed out, isn't it? I mean, these are personal tastes in the end. In any case, also what they did, especially from the 1960s, they were very vocal about it, not before, about the so-called re-education, Umerziehung of Germans and Austrians, which of course was one nation, one language, one nation. Das Band der Sprache, Martin Dörl has talked about that. Nils has mentioned even that idea of national language. So this idea of what they called Umerziehung, democratization, in fact, you know, that the Americans forced upon, especially the Germans, was criticized, and people who went against it were praised for it in their publication. They couldn't do it before the 60s. They would have gotten into trouble, into legal trouble and into political trouble. But from the 60s on, it was possible to be more vocal about it. So I had a look at the Verein Muttersprache under Goethe's motto, or it's not only Goethe's motto, it's in fact the common German saying, ne? Sage mir, mit wem du umgehst, so sage ich dir, wer du bist. Loosely translated to show me your friends and I show you who you are. So what I did is I looked at the leadership of the Verein Muttersprache Wien. So there were a total of 52 members of the Executive Committee, which they call Ausschuss, sometimes Vorstand, they mostly call it Ausschuss. There were seven chairpersons in that time, including the deputies. These people are called Obmann, even when they are Frauen, of course, in that time. They wouldn't say Obfrau. They had 8 Schriftwarte or Schriftführer, and they had 7 treasurers. Säckelwart, very interesting. They didn't want to use the word Kasse. Kasse is definitely too un-German. Säckelwart, I mean, of course, it's also possibly holding up Austrianisms here. I don't want to, I mean, that's also another reason. Rechnungsprüfer, they said Bücherwart, interesting. I translated that as book custodians, the idea of really taking care of them. No? So no, it's not Bibliothekar or something like that, or sowas, but it's Bücherwart. Yeah, and then they had Beisitzer, or the Beirat, it was called, 20 over the time. The maximum of assessors they had 9 in 1968. Ah, that's a good year, isn't it? And in 1983, 84, they only had 1. So we can see it really going down. Yes, I also looked at organizations that took part in this exchange of publications. I give you my publication, you give me your publication, and we circulate it in the organization. Of course, without the internet, it wasn't easy to get hold of publications. And I also looked at other related organizations which they had friendly relations to, as they call it. So they supported each other in events by advertising, the activities of the other organization and so on. And I also looked at the 257 public lectures given by 119 individuals. So I looked at the individuals, especially who were those people. Yeah, and then I looked at the aforementioned fields of activity. So where were they active? What did they do? In which activities did they participate? What events did they use to voice their opinions and the like? And I'm coming to the results already. And let me just have a look at my phone, 36, okay? So if we see these numbers don't add up, ladies and gents, because I can't use my arrow here. That's a pity. Okay, so I hope you see what I'm talking about. So what I mean is these numbers don't add up in the sense of, you see 50% were members of the NSDAP and another 50% were aspiring to become a member. And of course, that's not together 100%, because not everybody was in the NSDAP in the first place of the members, and not even every Nazi was in the NSDAP. Interestingly enough, in case you don't know that, I just mentioned it, and 50% were supporters. So it's interesting because don't be confused by the numbers. You might want to say, a Nazi supporter is of course. It's not in relation to the aspirants and in relation to the members. So it's not absolute numbers that add up. I also looked at Eckhardbote, which is a publication of the Österreichische Landsmannschaft, which is considered as right-wing extremist. Not necessarily by me. These are not my opinions. I used official publications such as the Constitutional Police Report, Verfassungsschutzbericht, or Handbuch des Rechtsextremismus, and these sort of things. So authors in the Eckhardbote, in a right-wing organization, and people were right-wing extremists. They had right extremist connections after 1945. And when I say it's a right-wing organization, it's again a right-wing extremist organization. It's again not my personal opinion. It's an official classification. Interestingly enough, you can see none of them was, for example, a victim. None of them was active against right-wing in 1945, and nobody was sort of left of the chair people. When we look at the executive committee, it's a little bit better. Still, half of them were already active in a völkische Organisation before 1945. And some of them even pre-1933. We see that the members of NSDAP, Mitglieder und Bewerber are smaller. We have a good fifth of all people in the executive committee who were supporters of the National Socialism, and 37% authors of the Eckhardbote. Dichterstein Offenhausen, I always looked at the Dichterstein Offenhausen, which is a kind of memorial, now derelict, of what some Austrians considered good national poets and writers. It was nothing by the state. It was, again, a kind of right-wing thing. We have very few people who were critical against National Socialism or even victims. It's probably only one person here, 4.2. We can see that. But we've got some people who were not politically right-wing, so it's not right-wing. Nobody active against right-wing activities in 1945 there in the committee. So we see that the NSDAP members and aspirant comes to a third, and we can see that those people with still connections to extreme right-wing is half, so that's a lot, admittedly. I'm now going to talk a bit about the publications. Again, of course, numbers don't add up. This is also stuff what you can see here from the top to the bottom. So it was mostly exchanged with sort of clubs, private association, Vereine. Then there were some professional organizations. Then there were unions. And let's keep in mind, unions are not necessarily, don't necessarily have a social democratic background. They can also be. They can be the union of state employees, for example. What kind of publications were they? Academic journals, more or less, or were they only journals that exclusively dealt with language protection? Were they politically left? Well, only 3.2%. Were they neutral? Yes, a quarter. No? Were they right? And so on. So you can see here, even 6.5% were forbidden after 1945. Especially temporarily. So you might say, how could they exchange with them? Well, because they started exchanging quite early, and some of them were then not forbidden anymore after 1945. But the interesting thing is, in my view, that if we look at the relatively right wing, and I'm not counting something like Christian Democrats right wing, not at all, it'd be absurd. We're really talking about, for example, so it's not ÖVP, no? It's more like FPÖ, and its predecessor, especially the VDU, Verband der Unabhängigen, which was in its first years, which represented actually the members of Nazi organizations in the beginning. So that comes down to 42%. And then, of course, we see that these temporarily forbidden after 1945 were only 6.5%. You must imagine that after the war, some publications were forbidden, and in 1949, when the Verein Muttersprache came into being, they were allowed again. They were publicized again. It became a bit less strict, really. And we've got, about a fifth or up to a quarter of National Socialists involved in the organizations that publish those publications. So if you look at connected organizations, we can see that most of them, 47%, are political organizations. They are not language protecting organizations. Language protection organizations are only 20%. And I call 20% scientific. I should have maybe just called it academic in the sense of Deutsch, in the German term, Wissenschaft, so not hard sciences. And 13% were other publications such as Briefmarkensammlerclub, the Stamp Collectors Association, and so on. And if we look at those organizations, we can see that 40% are politically neutral, but we can still see again here 60% that several were relatively right-wing, and some were right-wing extremists. These organizations were right-wing extremist organizations. They come up in the Austrian Handbuch des Rechtsextremismus and are classified as such. And we've got 1/3 of them where National Socialists are involved in the leadership of these organizations. Ex-National Socialists, possibly still National Socialists. Obviously you couldn't say it, or you still can't say it. The guest lecturers, the 119 were mostly professors or university teachers in that sense, almost half, followed by school teachers and civil servants. Then there were writers, authors, some self-employed people, you would think, why self-employed people? Well, it was a Bergbauingenieur talking about foreign words in mining, for example, stuff like that. And artists, you know, there were sculptors, all sorts of people talking. And if we look at the political view of these people, again, we can see that what sticks out clearly is supporters of National Socialism, members of other National Socialist organizations, and members or aspirant of NSDAP again. Whereas non-right-wing people were only 4%, 3.9 really, and some were active against right-wing extremism, though, and there were 10%. That's not so bad, is it? And we even have 14% victims of National Socialism among them. So I can see we're running out of time, but that's good in a sense because I'm coming to the summary. And as you can see, for those first 35 years of the association is that half of them had been members of the NSDAP, had in addition belonged to other organizations. That can be something ranging from harmless like Reichsluftschutzbund up to extreme SS branches and so on. In 1949, a third of these deputy people still had connections to right-wing organizations, and none of them was critical to the Nazis, none of them neutral, none of them politically left. And with the committee members, a similar picture, albeit not so extreme. Half of them still had connections to right-wing extremist organizations after 49, and only 4.2 of them were critical towards National Socialism or neutral. Looking at the publications, 42% were relatively right-wing or right-wing, or even right-wing extremists. 6.2 had been banned, 6.5, at least temporary after 1945, and only 3.2 can be considered as relatively left, so Gewerkschafts, traditional union publications and the like. 60% of the related organizations were politically right-wing or relatively right-wing or even extremist, and none of them was left. Over half of the lecturers had been active supporters after 1945, keep that in mind, so active supporters of National Socialism. After 1949, 15% still have Nazi connections, still had connections to right-wing organizations. That's a lot. And about the about the same number, let's not, 1% difference of them were victims of Nazism, whereas a mere 3.9 were actively against it in 1949. So we can see that at least for the time of 49 to 84, the heydays of the Verein Muttersprache, we must really classify them as a political right-wing or right-wing extremist organization, or at least, the people that are active in there, well, we can call it a right-wing organization. I'd like to finish by just saying that it exists still today, though they have problems finding new members. Überalterung, so the old people are leaving naturally, so to say, and by death, and it's much less active today, but it's still active. 3 examples for their publication. 1967, that's how it looked in the beginning. No pictures, all black and white, all in Fraktur. In 2000, you can see it's all about Heimat and traditional outfit. Fraktur still, a little bit of Antiqua already here. And then we see in one of the most current ones, still the Heimat motif there, of course, but now no Fraktur left on the front page, at least. Some pages are in Fraktur. There are other organizations. I'd just like to briefly mention the Interessengemeinschaft Muttersprache Graz. They have a very nice website, as you can see, quite professional. And they're also on Facebook, so they are quite modern. And it's small, but it's active, more active and more informative than the Verein Muttersprache. I think that small Interessengemeinschaft here. And that is it. I just have what I call Minimalbiografie. It's just the absolute minimum you need to read about the ADSV, about Tekusch, and about the VMW. Oh, sorry, I'm there all the time, but top opportunity to advertise my work a bit. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Falco. That's absolutely fascinating. And I'm really pleased that we had this to sum up so many strands we have been discussing. I would have quite a number of questions, but before I come in, for example, the relationship to religion as well and Luther, I'll hand over to Louise and Caroline.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to start or...
As you prefer. I have also questions, so I just go if that's all right with you, Louise.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering which role the Austrian literature played within these Sprachvereine. Just when you mentioned the very first Sprachvereine and then the successor organizations, I immediately starting to think about Karl Kraus and his attempts to purify or protect, not purify in a sense, but to protect the German language, and then continuing with Friede Jelinek or Thomas Bernhard. Could you say something on how these authors were perceived or how they actually reacted to these kinds of attempts forwarded by the language societies you talked about?
Yeah, what I can say is, for the time I was talking about, is that Karl Kraus is not mentioned even. So it's just a non-person. And that tells you something, as I always say to everybody, to my students, particularly, absence means something. It's not there means something, you know. It doesn't mean, oh, it's not there. It has absence has a significance. The Friede Jelinek, no, is a no. But they were very much into people like Josef Weinheber, for example. We're not surprised. Or the Heimat, everything that was Heimat literature, even if we would consider it a little bit schmaltzy today. You can see that already from, I mean, there is this connection of the whole picture of, you saw the title page of their publication. It's all about the mountains, the traditional, die Trachten, deutsches Liedgut, and it's not even specifically Austrian, you know. They consider themselves, the vast majority of these people, and I dare say still today, consider themselves as Germans, the German nation, you know, the Austrian, the Ostmark, huh? in a way. So if you hope to have reactions there on authors like Jelinek, for example, or Thomas Bernhard or so on, yeah, of course they are not even mentioned. They're not even mentioned. I have not found anything. There might, I'm not saying there is not a half a sentence where they say Schmierfink Bernhard or something like that, nah? But surely the way they have a go at only people whom they perceive as un-German. I mean, you can imagine what go they would have at people who are, you know, like Thomas Bernhard and Friede Jelinek, no? Karl Kraus, impossible, yeah.
I would have expected that maybe there would be some kind of counter reaction to these very prominent figures in these attempts, but obviously not. Maybe it's just Karl Kraus' fate not to be mentioned at all, which is such a pity. So to our students, if you have the chance, just give it a go. I think he's really a brilliant author.
Yeah, I have Die Fackel at home.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
A very nice new biography on him. I think it's written by Jens Malte Fischer. It's a really extended one, but it's worth giving it a go. So
good. I'd just like to mention one more thing, because you were talking about, you know, writers, and of course they were, well, of course, I mean, they were very interested in Schiller, of course, and they participated in the there was a very big celebration in 1959 in Vienna, the Schiller Fire. And it was the first time that the right-wing organizations were, you know, on the streets in mass. So you had the Burschenschaften, the student organizations in their outfit. You had the Turnerbünde. You had these very traditional national conservative organizations. And this is what the Muttersprache was. And I mean, Weinheber, they have even published the complete works of Weinheber in a new edition with his widow together. So there's a Weinheber cult there, really, and I'm writing about Weinheber cult in one of the smaller chapters of my book. So.
Would you say that actually they just don't really focus on these matters? It's not interesting to them to come up with a certain canon of codified literature, or do they actually have or push forward a certain idea on an Austrian or German literature canon?
Absolutely, and that's the idea of Dichterstein, Offenhausen. So I mean, I can really recommend. I mean, you know, for my students, I always say Wikipedia is a good starting point because it gives you a summary that is decent, and it gives you literature that is literature that leads you to literature, which then leads you to even better literature. So you can see that. I mean, most of the authors mentioned there, I'm not even familiar with. They are fringe authors. Brehm, for example, is one that comes to my mind. Bruno Brehm. There are several, you know, several writers that were held in high regard by the National Socialists and then had a bit of a downfall. Afterwards, they were still held high up. So they had an idea of what is good literature, and it basically coincides or is congruent with Dichterstein Offenhausen idea, which was very, very much supported by the Verein Deutsche Sprache. And actually, some of their members had the shield, Dichterstein Schild, which was a kind of a badge of honor given to them for their efforts to, you know, to make these writers known, these national writers.
I just put that the Wikipedia article in the chat. Perhaps an appeal to any of the students. Editing Wikipedia is always a good way into research. So if there is no English translation of that article, that might be a good starting point for anybody who wants to experience some Wikipedia editing.
Or teachers can do it as part of their translation seminars and then upload it, which is nice. I did that a couple of times, actually.
Yeah, good. Luise?
Thank you. I think we've lost Caroline for a moment.
There she is again.
Okay, great.
We're frozen, Caroline, but it was a nice picture that was frozen, not one of those pictures where you go like, oh my God.
I think the Wi-Fi connection broke down. I'm terribly sorry about that.
But let's go over to Luise anyway.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your lecture, Falco. I was wondering because you clearly showed that the Verein Muttersprache kind of holds up the picture of Heimat and Heimatverbundenheit, and on the other hand, there were attempts like the use of the genitive, which is kind of more seen as higher language. So my question would be, did they position themselves to dialects in any way?
You know, you might remember Nils' lecture and what Nils said about purism in the area of lexic. So the idea was that for example, I'm coming to your question in a sec, but what I'm talking about is when there were words that were perceived as too foreign to be German, they wanted to replace them by German words, and then often, in that case, they often used the dialects as a source for lexical items that could be established as replacements of Säckelwart, no? Something like that. Generally, they were in favor of Pflege der Dialekte, so promotion of the regional dialects, but it was not in this. They would not think of an Austrian variety. You know, the dialects were part of I mean, they were very concerned, first of all, about the standard German, and that was standard Bundesdeutsches German, in their view. They were not happy with the Austrian dictionary. They were not happy with they are not happy. They would be very unhappy with Rudolf Moore, for example, and these people who work on the Austrian Wörterbuch and so on. They had problems with one of their members, a linguist, a chairperson who was working on the Austrian dictionary. So what you have to keep in mind is they were standard German was the good German, and dialect was there, but that was a different area. that was kind of the Gemütlichkeit, home language that you would speak, you know, so really a little bit like, you know, when you think about purists in, say, France or Spain, where they would say, yeah, you can speak Occitan, but please do it at home with the kids, no? Galician, yeah, speak that with your family, but that's not Spanish or Catalan, no? That's not Spanish. Best speak it at home, not in school. So that's not at all unusual, I would say. I'm not sure if have I answered your question?
Yes, you have. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
Good. Thank you for the question. It's very interesting, this because the dialects, of course, are grammatically often different. I mean, what is a dialect? We had that with Nils, no? And I mean, if it comes to Low German, it gets even more extreme, no? Because there we have significant changes in the grammar. So that could be a language, no? I mean, language, dialect. Anyway, I don't want to go into that mess. Don't want to open that Pandora's box.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting because in comparison to Germany, in Austria, the dialects are much more represented in media, for example.
And I mean,
have a higher value. So.
Also look at Switzerland. I mean, everybody speaks Swiss German, but not in official, I mean, more and more maybe, but, you know, the news and so on, that is really standard High German. It's not Swiss German, but you won't find anybody speaking High German unless they are Germans in Zurich. No? So thank you.
Before handing over to the students, I have one burning question which follows on from literature and dialect, and that would be religion. Because I saw some of overlap with what the Deutsche Christen would have propagated during National Socialism. But it seemed to me even in some regards more extreme and doing away with Christianity as a concept altogether.
Yeah, I mean, we know, of course, from the Nazis that the Nazis were particularly opposed to Catholicism. On the other hand, they were, at the same time, they were, of course, not so, you know, these pseudo-German religions, they wouldn't support that either. And I mean, if we look at Austria today, and if we look at the Verein Muttersprache, they do not make any statements whatsoever in terms of religion. So we cannot see any discourse there. We cannot see that, for example, there are any religious discourses in their publications. So we wouldn't find, you know, prayers or religious text in there, unless it's in Christmas or so, or Easter, as part of the general culture, not particular religion. But I would say religion plays no role. And I would even say, I mean, because it's Austrian, it's naturally, the members are, at least on paper, Catholic.
Yeah.
But I could not see any religious discourse whatsoever. For example, you know, things like going to church, promotion of going to church on Sunday, or these kind of things which one would expect, maybe nothing there. But is that actually what you were asking, Henrike?
Yeah, partly that, and I think you're absolutely right that it has something to do with denominational association, because in Germany it's overlapping with the discourse of Luther der Deutsche.
Yeah.
I have been looking at the Luther celebration, which was in a way similar to the Schiller celebrations in 1983, where very diverse groups were celebrating different aspects of Luther.
Indeed.
And there was still the old guard of national right-wing people celebrating Luther der Deutsche, and that, of course, doesn't work with Austrian.
No. I mean, we are aware of the role of Luther in standardization because of his Bible translation. But I mean, of course, it was Sächsische Kanzlei then, and it was you know, that brings us maybe to language and power. The question of, I mean, also in the first editions of his Bible, specifically dedicating it to a certain geographical area, to a certain person in power, and thereby you know, also enforcing maybe the influence of that power, of that power.
Many thanks. With that, we have also made a link back to our very first session in this lecture series. And it was a wonderful overview, and I hope many of you can re-listen to it and also can join us next week when we are looking at totalitarian language.
Thank you very much, Henrike, for organizing